Good morning and welcome to another online Sunday school class with Tunnel Hill Baptist Church. As always, we like to begin by reminding you that we here at Tunnel Hill Baptist Church believe that Jesus is the Christ, that He is the Son of the living God who lived a perfect life and died a sacrificial death for your sins and for mine, and that if you will place your hope and trust in Jesus Christ as both Lord and Savior, that you will be saved. If you would like more information about what it means to make Jesus Christ your Lord and Savior, we would invite you to follow the link in our description that will take you to a full gospel presentation, and it'll also show you how to respond to the gospel and how to connect with Tunnel Hill Baptist Church. If you live in the Hardin County, Kentucky area, we would love to invite you to worship at 11 o'clock on Sunday mornings right here at Tunnel Hill Baptist Church. You can also find us online through Facebook Live. If you do not live in the Hardin County, Kentucky area, we still want to connect with you and help you find a Bible-believing church where you do live. As we continue on in our study of the books of 1st and 2nd Kings, we are in session 7, which is titled Hope. And we're going to be looking at 1 Kings chapter 19, verses 9 through 18. So again, this is session 7, titled Hope, looking at 1 Kings chapter 19, verses 9 through 18. And I want to begin with a question that might seem a little off topic, but I want to assure you that it is actually on topic. And it's this: it's what would you include in a list of 5 reasons a person might suddenly quit a job? So if you think about maybe reasons that you have quit a job in the past, maybe you ended up looking for employment elsewhere and ultimately quit, or maybe you just finally said, you know what, I don't need this, and just outright quit a job and walked away immediately. But what would you think are 5 reasons why a person might quit a job? Now, here's what we want you to do. We want you to pause this video and take some time to actually respond to questions as we ask them. So if you're watching this by yourself, we would encourage you to get a pen and paper, and as we ask questions, write down the questions, take notes as you go along so that you can kind of interact with us as we're watching this video. If you are watching this with your spouse or your family, we would encourage you to actually take the time to have these discussions. And then in both cases, whenever you're ready, just hit play again, and then we'll continue on in our study. So again, the question is this: what would you include in a list of 5 reasons a person might suddenly, that's what the question asks, suddenly quit a job? Take a couple minutes and discuss that, and then we'll continue on in our study. All right, so what are 5 reasons that someone might suddenly quit their job? The things that come to mind, first off, is an unreasonable or a dishonest boss. I hear more often than anything the number one reason why people quit a job is actually their superiors. It's their managers, it's their bosses, it's the people directly over them that create just a hard working environment. And most people don't quit jobs, they quit bosses, and they don't want to have people work for them. I'd say that'd be number one. Another reason I might get is an unsafe work environment. If you begin to recognize that that the place that you are working is dangerous, and that if you continue to work there, it might be might cause injury to you, I think that might be a reason. Another reason is dishonesty from the work in general. They're encouraging you, whether it's a boss or the company as a whole, to be dishonest, to lie to people or to do something like that, and you recognize that you're working, for lack of better words, you're working for crooks, and that would be something that might cause you to walk away. Another one is not getting paid what you were promised. I think that if you started working for a place and it suddenly became abundantly clear that the place you were working was not going to pay you the way they said they were going to pay you, I think that might have a lot to do with it. And maybe the last thing is just an unsafe work or a toxic work environment. Maybe you have coworkers or just a general culture around the office that you recognize is bad for you. That could be anything from wanting you to do bad things and encouraging you to do things that you would recognize as sinful or addicting, or even doing things that might compromise your home or your family. Might be all reasons that you would suddenly quit a job. And I'm sure there are many other reasons. And when we think about reasons that we might want to quit a job, a lot of times you recognize that is something that creates a danger to yourself, or a feeling of isolation and loneliness that ultimately leads you to want to just immediately step away from the job. And the reason why we ask this question is because we're going to be looking at a passage dealing with the prophet Elijah. And we're going to be looking at Elijah and a time in his life where he did want to quit. He was ready to be done. In fact, he was so ready to be done that he would have really rather died than continue doing what God had called him to do, to continue serving in the office of prophet. The book says it this way. It says, in last week's study, Elijah trusted God in a big way and in a showdown with these false prophets of Baal or Baal, with all of Israel worshiping God. In today's study, we find Elijah in a very different place. And let me explain what's happened here. So as we left our study yesterday, Elijah had this major victory. He had set up this showdown between the prophets of Baal and God, and the prophets of Baal tried to call down fire from heaven and failed to do so, that their false god did not show up. And then God did show up, and God not only lit the fire, but he completely vaporized the whole altar and made it abundantly clear to the nation of Israel that Yahweh, that the one true God, was real. Okay? And in doing so, they ended up going and they slaughtered the prophets of Baal. And there's this moment where you think that Israel is going to turn their hearts back to God and forsake all of these false idols. Well, immediately upon the coattails of this event, word gets to the queen, which is Jezebel, that the prophets of Baal have been destroyed, that Elijah has had this great victory, and all these things have happened. And Jezebel's response to this is a threat on the life of Elijah. And so what she tells him is, what you did to my prophets, I'm going to do to you. And for whatever reason, Elijah had reason to believe that this was a credible threat and that he was in grave danger. Because of this, he ends up running away. And he actually runs a great distance away, and he gets as far away from Damascus and from the nation of Israel as he possibly can, for fear that she is going to actually bring armies or bring assassins or whoever it might be in order to destroy them. And in this moment, in this time of loneliness and feeling like, even though he had this great victory, that still the same threats in his life existed, he is going to be in an extremely down state. The book says it this way. It says, Elijah fled south to Beersheba, then all the way to Mount Horeb. He felt alone, he was exhausted, and he was ready to quit. But we see God reassure Elijah and remind him that there is still work to be done. Elijah is now, when we get into our text today, Elijah is now hiding in a cave, fearful and discouraged. And let's see what God does with Elijah in the cave. So let's get into our text today, and we're going to be looking at 1 Kings chapter 19, and we're going to start in verse 9 and read verses 9 and verse 10. And as we do so, I want you to listen for the conversation between Elijah and God. So let's get into it. It says this. This is picking up in verse 19, verse 9 and 10. It says, suddenly the word of the Lord came to him being Elijah, and he said to him, what are you doing here, Elijah? And he replied, I have been very zealous for the Lord of armies, but the Israelites have abandoned your covenant, torn down your altars, and killed your prophets with the sword. I alone am left, and they are looking for me to take my life. So as we look at this passage, one of the first things I want you to kind of notice is God asked Elijah a question, but not because God needed the answer. This is one of those kind of great questions of the Bible that God asks knowing the answer, but wanting to hear the answer come from Elijah. He is looking for that honest answer. And I truly believe that's exactly what he gets. He asks Elijah, what are you doing here? Why are you out in the middle of nowhere? Why are you out in the wilderness? And he says, because I'm it. I'm all that's left. He says, you look at the nation of Israel, you look at this northern kingdom, maybe specifically. The northern kingdom, the Israelites, they have forsaken your covenant, they've torn down your altars, they've killed your prophets, and I'm left. I'm all that's left. And he's just kind of like, and I wish I was gone. I wish that I wasn't left. It's all said and done. In saying that, the book asks this question. I want you to think about Elijah's emotional state, kind of what we can deduce based on what he says, and then answer this question. What factors might contribute to people feeling alone even when they are doing God's work? How does discouragement contribute to feelings of isolation? Take a couple minutes, pause the video, and discuss that. What factors might contribute to someone feeling alone even while doing God's work? And how does discouragement contribute to feeling isolation? Pause the video, discuss that, and then we'll continue on in our study. So this is a question that I think really hits home with pastors. In fact, I know that here in a few days, from when I'm recording this, we're going to have this discussion in person at church. And we're going to probably talk about that with not only myself, but some other people that have been on staff at churches that are now attending our church. And I imagine all three of us have felt this thing that we're talking about here, has felt the discouragement, has felt the isolation that comes with even doing ministry. And so I don't want to belabor it too much to make it sound like complaining or whining about maybe serving in the office of pastor or in some way, shape, or form on church staff. But there is no question that even when you are serving the Lord, and maybe even especially when you are serving the Lord, there come seasons and there come times when you feel all alone. And a lot of times when we go through hard times, and that can be hard times because of a loss of job, that could be hard times because of maybe a divorce that's happened in your life, that could be hard times because of church division and dissension. There can be those times where you go through particularly discouraging and stressful times and you feel all alone. You feel like no one really understands what you're going through, that no one really wants to listen to you, that you might feel like your complaining is unwelcome and therefore you keep that to yourself. And all of that can ultimately heap a very heavy burden on you, that you are all alone and no one really understands you. And that's really where Elijah is right now. He has had great victories. He's been used by God in mighty ways. And yet I imagine there's part of Elijah that feels like he's had all of this success and yet nothing seems to have changed. Ahab is still king. Jezebel is still queen. The people of Israel really haven't had the revival that he was hoping for or that he had intended. And because of that lack of revival, he feels very isolated. He feels like he is failing. He feels like everyone is against him and no one really understands what he's going through. And for that reason, he's withdrawn. He's isolated himself. And so to say of all that is I definitely get what Elijah is feeling. And I bet there's been seasons in your life where you felt that way too. And like I said, whether it was maybe caused from a divorce or a loss of a loved one, maybe a spouse, or maybe a friend that turned on you, that abandoned you, that has left you in this feeling of you are all alone. And we can relate to Elijah in this passage. The book goes on to say this: you can recognize the desperation in Elijah's words. He has spent days considering how far he had come, not just geographically, but emotionally and spiritually. He has gone from victor to victim. He has gone from winner to whiner. He has gone from faithful to fearful, and he feels like a failure. That's what I mentioned earlier. Hiding in the cave, Elijah was isolated and weary, and he felt spiritually vulnerable, yet God had not abandoned him. The passage, if you read the context, points out that he is on Mount Horeb, and one of the interesting things it says in the passage is that he is in the cave in Mount Horeb, and that is a reference all the way back to the book of Exodus where God had appeared to Moses. And so there's kind of a statement being made here that not only is Elijah in a cave in Mount Horeb, but that he very well might be in the cave that Moses was on when he kind of had his encounter with God. So clearly this is a special place. And let's see what happens. Let's look at 1 Kings chapter 19. We're going to read verses 11 through 14. And as we do so, I want you to listen for the very different ways that God reveals himself to Elijah. There's a noteworthiness to how God kind of appears before Elijah. This is what it says. Then he said, he being God this time, then he said, "Go out and stand on the mountain in the Lord's presence." At that moment, the Lord passed by a great and mighty wind. It was tearing at the mountain and was shattering cliffs before the Lord, but the Lord was not in the wind. After the wind, there was an earthquake, but the Lord was not in the earthquake. After the earthquake, there was a fire, but the Lord was not in the fire. And after the fire, there was a voice, a soft whisper. When Elijah heard it, he wrapped his face in a mantle, and he went out and stood at the entrance of the cave. Suddenly, a voice came to him and said, "What are you doing here, Elijah?" "I have been zealous for the Lord, the God of armies," he replied. "But the Israelites have abandoned your covenant, torn your altars, and killed your prophets with the sword. I alone am left, and they're looking for me to take my life." So as we look at this passage again, we see God says, okay, I'm going to show up to you. I want you to come out into my presence. This is not only, I mentioned already, this is not the only time that Mount Horeb is mentioned in the Bible, that God also found Moses on Mount Horeb and showed himself there. It says it showed him as a burning bush and commissioned him to lead the people out of bondage. This is in Exodus chapter 3, verses 1 and 2. And then when he shows himself to Elijah, he shows himself in some of these magnificent ways. And if we kind of think about this, we have a very stark contrast. And what's interesting is the first three things that we see happen, and the first three ways that God kind of gets Elijah's attention, because remember, it's not that God is in those things. I mean, he's certainly doing those things, but that's not where God is. That's not what draws Elijah out of the cave. These are things that God uses in the past. He's used great earthquakes and winds and fires. And you think about that first wind passes through, and it is so powerful that it is whipping up the stone and the rock around the mountain. There was probably gravel there. There's loose rock that was being blown about and rock flying everywhere, so much so that portions of the mountain, that stone pieces were coming loose and falling down into ravines or valleys or whatever. This is followed by the earthquake that shakes everything, probably to the same extent, and then this fire, which would have been something to behold, this fire that kind of appears out of nowhere, seems to just overwhelm everything, and then probably very quickly passes by. And we see all of these things that demonstrate the huge and awesome power of God, and then all of these things are followed by a very gentle breeze. The way the Christian Standard Bible presents that, in the midst of all this, it says that after the earthquake, a fire, but the Lord was not in the fire. And then after the fire, there was a voice, a soft whisper. That was verse 12. The word there, that voice or soft whisper, is also a word that is used to say like a very gentle breeze, a zephyr, if you will, where there is just almost a pleasant breeze coming out. And in the midst of that pleasant breeze, there was probably the very voice of God, the whisper of God. And that's what drew Elijah out of the cave to go be in the presence of God. What a strong contrast to the powerful acts that he had seen before that. The book leads us to ask this question. What sometimes makes a whisper more effective than a loud wind or a jarring earthquake? And when I was thinking about that, I was thinking about a parent who is instructing their kid, especially if it's in a disciplinary situation, that instead of instead of yelling and shouting and throwing things or doing whatever and really kind of throwing a temper tantrum maybe along with their child, instead their voice gets very quiet and very low, and they begin to speak very seriously and very directly to the child. Sometimes that is far more effective in getting the child's attention and causing them to focus it on what the parent is saying than all the rest of it. My wife is very good about that. I tend to be more of the yeller. I know that's not a surprise to you. But my wife is very good at saying, no, we're not doing this. You need to listen to me. This is what we're going to do. These are your options. And if you do not follow those options, then we will go home, or whatever the consequences may be. And what it does is, what you notice is in the midst of all of the stimuli, in the midst of all of the temper tantrum that's going on, that clear, soft voice begins to cause them to dial in and to focus in on what my wife is saying. And that helps them to not only calm down, but then ultimately to receive what's being said. And so, and then even beyond that, and when I read this initially, what kind of was struck to my mind was not only is God representing his huge power and his what he is capable of in the wind and the earthquake and the fire, but also he goes in to represent kind of a softness and an intimacy and a soft touch at the end. I was very much so reminded of Revelation chapter 1, where John witnesses Christ and his glorified self, and he begins to describe him, and he talks about, this wind, or his words are like rushing water. There's a sword in his mouth. He's shines like burnished bronze. He looks strong. His robes and his beard are white to represent purity, and you get this amazingly powerful, awesome picture of the glorified Jesus in his resurrected body. And then it says that John fell on the ground like a dead man, and then that Jesus came up and touched him and said, get up. And there was a softness to that touch. And so you have, again, this contrast of this huge, awesome, wonderful, powerful God that can do whatever he wants. And then you have the contrast that this huge, awesome, wonderful, powerful God is also caring and loving and soft to his people because of his great love for them. And so I think we see that in this text just like we see it in Revelation. And I think it should give us such hope and confidence that not only is our God able to do whatever he wills, but he is caring enough to hear our prayers and act on our behalf. That leads us to this question. What does God repeating his question and Elijah providing the same response in this verse tell us about Elijah's state of mind? So we've gotten this great demonstration of God. He asked the same question again, and nothing has changed. Sees the rocks fall, sees the fires burn, sees the earth shake, or feels the earth shake, and yet nothing has changed in Elijah's thoughts and perspective and his state of mind. What does that reveal to us about Elijah, and what situations might cause someone to feel the same way today? Take a couple minutes to discuss that, and then we'll keep going in our study. All right, so what does this passage reveal about Elijah's state of mind, and how do we see that today? And I think in both cases, I think Elijah is very focused on Elijah. Elijah has seen the great things that God has done. He has experienced kind of this moment out in the gentle breeze and in the very presence of God, and yet Elijah is so focused on Elijah that he cannot see what God is trying to even communicate through these powerful acts. And so even after he sees all this, God asks him the same question. And when God asks him that same question, nothing's changed because he is so focused on Elijah. And I think we do that today. I think we as people become so focused and overwhelmed and consumed with our own situation that sometimes we can't see God work or be working around us, where we want this and we want this right now. And because we're so focused on this and what we want and how we want it right now, that we fail to see how God is working all around that thing to maybe even bring about something better, or to cause us to learn and cause us to see his will and see what he's doing and rejoice over what God is actually doing. Because sometimes what we want and when we want it is actually not the best thing for us or for the people around us. And so when we get self-centered, when we get focused on that, our opinions don't change, and we miss out on all the wonderful things that God is doing. The book says this, it says, sometimes our lives feel loud, with many distractions clamoring for our attention. Maybe we need to tune our hearts and listen better to God's whispers in our lives. And that's basically what we're talking about when we say we don't hear from God because we're so focused in on us and in this world and this life. Let's read our last passage and how God responds to all of this. And this is found in verses 15 through 18. So we're going to be reading 1 Kings 19, 15 through 18. And I want you to look for the instructions that God gives Elijah and the promise that he makes to him. So let's look at this. And we're picking up in verse 15, and it says this, Then the Lord said to him, Go and return by the way you came to the wilderness of Damascus. When you arrive, you are to anoint Hazael as king of Aram. You are to anoint Jehu, son of Nimshi, as the king over Israel, and Elisha, son of Japhat, from Abel Meholah, as prophet in your place. Then Jehu will put to death whoever escapes the sword of Hazael, and Elisha will put to death whoever escapes the sword of Jehu. And I will leave 7,000 in Israel, every knee that has not bowed to Baal, and every mouth that has not kissed him. So, as we get to this one, we see a couple of neat things happening. First off, he gives him a task. He says, listen, it's time for you to go to work. These are the things you're doing. And I want you to notice that everything about this represents a dramatic change in the landscape around him. If you look at kind of Elijah and what maybe his initial complaint was, is that he had this tremendous victory. And yet, in his opinion, nothing's changed. Everybody's still after him. Israel is still neglecting the Lord and has abandoned the covenant, and nothing has changed. And so God tells him, things are about to change. And you're going to do some things that are going to show that this change is coming. First off, the king of Aram is going to change. And there's going to be a new king in Aram. Not only is there going to be a new king in Aram, but there's going to be a new king in the northern kingdom. There's going to be a new king in Israel. And not only is there going to be a new king in Israel, but there's going to be a new prophet to take up where you've left off and to continue on with the work. And then he says, and this is going to create a dramatic change. And so that the people that you're afraid of, the people that you feel like have abandoned me and all these things, they're going to be dealt with. That's kind of a sad but true reality. He says, listen, there's some of them are going to fall by the king of Aram, some of them are going to fall by the king of Israel, and the rest of them will fall not on necessarily Elijah doing violent acts or war, but they will be condemned by the words of Elisha. So none of them are going to escape my judgment, whether it be by sword or by judgment through the prophet. God did not correct Elijah for being afraid or feeling such a heavy load of despair. What he did do was give Elijah some tasks to complete. And I think that's an interesting fact. He didn't say, shame on you for feeling this way. I can't believe you think that I'm just going to give up or that I don't have any strength. He says, listen, I'm powerful enough to deal with this. He just says, you know what, Elijah? I've got some work for you to do. And this work is going to show you, I really believe this work is going to show you that change is happening and that I'm bringing about change. And therefore, I think the therefore here is you don't need to be discouraged. One of the things I think that for us and in our life, we need to remember that God is working according to His time and God is doing His thing. And as we serve Him, the way that happens may differ. And then suddenly you realize that as you get down the road, that change has happened. And that a lot of times, even if we're serving faithfully, good things have happened, even though we didn't necessarily see it in the midst of that. I feel that way even now in my ministry, having been the pastor here and one of the preaching people for almost 10 years. If you look at the way the church was 10 years ago, we've seen a tremendous amount of change. Some has been good, some has been not so good. But as we look at where we're here now, we recognize that God has been in the midst of all of it. The book asks this question. I want to hand this to you to pause the video and to discuss. It's this: how can being reminded that God has a work for us to serve as a motivator that can lift us up out of despair. So how can being reminded that God has a work for us to do serve as a motivator for us and lift us up out of despair? Take a couple minutes to discuss that, and then we'll finish up our study. So I think that it does. I will just say that I think sometimes being reminded that there is work yet to be done motivates us to kind of stop feeling sorry for ourselves. As I mentioned earlier, Elijah seems to be very focused on himself and on his situation. Even last Sunday, we during our time wrapping up the book of Titus, there was kind of that reminder that it's not just about us and our comfort and the small little place that we live, but it's about the kingdom and that we should have a heart for the lost, and that we should be training people up, and that we should be concerned about not just the church right now, but the church 20 years from now, and not only the church right here in this area, but the church in the whole globe. And we should think about those things, and it's not just about us. And I think that's the same thing that getting this task does for Elijah, is it pulls Elijah out of that funk of, well, my ministry has failed and my things aren't going well, and this little place that God has called me to is still far from God, and says, listen, you're not done yet. That God is still moving, and God is still working, and God is going to continue to do so even long after you're gone. And you go, oh wait, it's not about me. It's about God, and it's about the kingdom, and He's going to accomplish His goodwill, and I just need to keep serving. And I think that does pull us up out of the thing, and as long as we have that goal set before us, that helps us continue to move forward. And I think that's something we need to remember as we live life, both just live life under the sun and live life, working towards the kingdom, is that our call and our mission is not something so small as just having a job or being, a lot of times, something like being a soldier or having one particular ministry in the church, but rather God has called us to the kingdom. And we constantly have that goal before us to not only become more and more like Christ every day as we continue to live life, but also to see the kingdom expanded. And that's going to take on many forms as we go through life, as God opens different doors of ministry to us. And we are never done serving Him, because what I think happens is the moment we get to a point where we think we are done growing or we are done serving, is discouragement and selfishness and getting wrapped up in the world begins to take us away from the things that God has created us to do. This leads us to kind of our last little bit. I want to look again at verse 18, and I want to notice what God says here in response to Elijah's words. Look again at verse 18. We read this. He says, "But I will leave 7,000 in Israel, every knee that is not bowed to Baal, and every mouth that has not kissed him." If you will remember, Elijah was convinced that he was alone, that he was the only one left, that all of Israel, that the entire northern kingdom had forsaken God's covenant, that all of the prophets that had faithfully followed God had been killed, and there was no one left but him, and even he was running for his life and about to die. And what God does in this statement is He tells them, He's like, that's not true. That in reality there are 7,000 people within the nation of Israel that have remained faithful and will continue to remain faithful, and from these 7,000 my covenant is maintained. And so when we think about our isolation, when we think about those statements that say I'm all alone, God is going to step in and He's going to say that's not true. I've heard it said in the past by different people that no one understands what I'm going through. No one gets the way I feel. No one does. And I think biblically, when we look at scriptures, that is an unbiblical statement. And I think that it's a dangerous statement, because that furthers the isolation. No one understands me. No one's been through what I've been through. And all that says, and what behind that is, no one can help me. No one can be there for me. No one can be that arm that we wrap around, that can wrap around me. And that's not good. That's not a good way to think. And in fact, we see in Scripture, no temptation is overtaken you, but such as is common to man. We look at the story of Elijah, and he says there are actually 7,000 people that have remained faithful to me, and you don't need to feel alone. And I think God would speak into us if we would listen to him and say, listen, you're not alone. While it may be true that no one has gone through the exact same life that you have gone through, that's the whole point of us, so that why we're all different, that all of us have lived slightly different lives. But it's a lie to say that no one can possibly understand what you're going through. But God has given us the church so that there might be people around us who have been through what we've been through, at least in a similar way, and can be the person to carry us, to encourage us, and to help us move forward in life. This leads us to our last question, which is this: how did knowing about God having a people who would stand beside him encourage Elijah for the work yet ahead? Here's what we want you to do. We want you to answer this question, whether it's writing or discussing it. Close your time in prayer, and then we want to encourage you to join us for worship at 11 o'clock, both in person at Tunnel Hill, excuse me, or online through Facebook Live. I'm going to ask that question one more time. How did knowing about God having a people who would stand beside him encourage Elijah to work for the work yet ahead? So how did knowing about God having a people who would stand beside him encourage Elijah for the work yet ahead? Discuss this, close in prayer, and then join us for worship at 11 o'clock. Thank you so much. We hope you will. God bless.